When I was 17, sitting at our scratch kitchen table doing homework, I made a promise that would haunt me for years. Dad was complaining about his back again, grumbling about getting old. Without thinking, I looked up from my math problems and said, "Don't worry, Dad. When you're old, I'll take care of you." He stopped mid-complaint, stared at me for a long moment, then burst into the cruelest laugh I'd ever heard. "You?" He slapped his knee like I'd told the funniest joke in the world. "Callie, you can't even take care of yourself. You'll never amount to anything." The words hit me like ice water. I went back to my homework, cheeks burning, swallowing the hurt like I always did. That laugh echoed in my head for 12 years, growing louder every time I doubted myself. I never imagined the day would come when I'd have the power to make him stop laughing forever. The call came at 3 in the morning on a rainy Tuesday in October. I fumbled for my phone, heart racing the way it always does when someone calls that late. The voice on the other end was professional, but tired. "Is this Callie Morrison? I'm calling from St. Mary's Hospital. Your father collapsed at the warehouse tonight." I sat up in bed, instantly awake. Dad was 67 and still working the night shift, too stubborn to retire. "Is he okay?" I asked, though part of me wondered why they were calling me at all. We barely spoke anymore. "He's stable, but he can't live alone anymore. His heart gave him a warning tonight. Are you able to be the responsible family member?" The nurse's words hung in the air. Responsible family member. The irony wasn't lost on me. The daughter he'd always called irresponsible was now his only option. "Yes," I said, surprising myself. "I'll be there." Walking back into Dad's house after so many years felt like entering a tomb. The smell hit me first. Stale beer, cigarettes, and something deeper that might have been loneliness. The same brown recliner sat in front of the television, held together with duct tape now. Empty beer bottles created small forests on every surface. Bills spilled out of boxes, yellow with age and neglect. Dad sat in his chair with an oxygen tube snaking under his nose, looking smaller than I remembered, but with the same hard eyes. When I walked in, he didn't say hello or thank you for coming. He just looked me up and down with that familiar disgust. "About time you showed up. Took you long enough." I set my purse down and surveyed the wreckage of his life. This is what I'd signed up for. This was my reward for being the good daughter. The first nursing home smelled like disinfectant trying to cover up death. The tour guide, a woman with kind eyes and tired hands, showed me around while I pretended to take notes. The residents sat in wheelchairs lining the hallways, staring at nothing. The rooms were tiny, with thin walls and plastic furniture. It cost more than I made in 6 months. The second place was nicer, but wanted a year's payment up front. The third facility seemed promising until I handed over Dad's paperwork. The administrator skimmed through it, her expression growing colder with each page. "I'm sorry, but we can't accept your father. Too much outstanding debts, too much medical history. He'd be considered a liability." I drove home that night with Dad's laugh from 12 years ago playing on repeat in my head. Maybe he was right about me after all. Back at his house, Dad acted like nothing had changed. He barked orders from his recliner like he was still the king of his crumbling castle. Coffee at 7 sharp, mail check twice daily, television volume loud enough to rattle the windows. When I suggested he might want to rest or take his medications on schedule, his eyes flashed with the old anger. "Don't you dare try to boss me around, Callie. You couldn't boss a puppy if you tried." He sneered at my attempts to organize his pills, mocked my cooking, and complained about everything from the temperature to the way I folded his laundry. I found myself clenching my fists until my nails left crescents in my palms, just like when I was a kid. But I wasn't 17 anymore. I was 29, tired, and slowly realizing that his bark might finally be worse than his bite. The power dynamic was shifting, even if he couldn't see it yet. While cleaning out his bedroom, I found an old leather notebook wedged behind a stack of hunting magazines. My hands trembled as I opened it, recognizing his sharp handwriting immediately. The first entry was dated 3 years ago. "Callie will never make it on her own. Too soft, too weak, complete waste of time and money." My blood turned to ice as I flipped through page after page of cruel observations. He documented my life like I was a failed experiment. Callie quit another job today, no backbone. She's dating that loser again, no judgment. Called crying about money, pathetic as always. Every perceived failure, every moment of vulnerability I had shared, cataloged with surgical precision. The final entry was from last month. If something happens to me, she'll probably put me in some dump and forget about me. That's what worthless daughters do. I closed the notebook with shaking hands. He'd been planning his revenge for years, never realizing he was handing me the evidence of his cruelty. A man in a wrinkled suit appeared at the front door on a Thursday morning, clutching a thick manila envelope. He barely glanced at me before shoving the papers into my hands. For Robert Morrison, have a nice day. Inside were medical bills dating back 5 years, credit card statements with balances that made my eyes water, and letters from collection agencies. The total was staggering, more money than I'd ever seen in one place. When I confronted Dad with the papers spread across his TV tray, he actually smiled. "Surprise," he said with mock cheerfulness. "Welcome to your inheritance, sweetheart. Hope you've been saving up." The casual way he said it, like financial ruin was just another Tuesday, made something inside me snap. "This isn't my debt, Dad. These are your choices." His smile widened. "Good luck proving that in court. Your name's on some of those papers too, you know. Co-signer for the truck, remember? You were 18 and stupid." My stomach dropped. I had signed that paper, trusting him completely. Juggling 2 jobs while managing Dad's constant needs was like trying to hold water in my hands. I'd rush from my morning shift at the diner to his doctor's appointments, then race to my evening job at the grocery store. My boss at the diner, Mrs. Chen, had been patient at first, but after the 3rd time I showed up 20 minutes late because Dad couldn't find his shoes, she pulled me aside. Her usually kind face was set in hard lines. "Callie, I like you, but this isn't working anymore. You're not reliable." Just like that, 40% of my income vanished. That night, I found Dad snoring in his recliner, an empty beer bottle sweating on the side table despite his heart medication warnings. The television was blaring some old Western at window-rattling volume. As I reached for the remote, my hands started shaking. Not from anger, but from the terrifying realization that he might actually be right about me. Maybe I really was too weak, too soft, too stupid to handle any of this. Maybe I'd been fooling myself all these years. It happened so fast, I barely had time to react. Dad had been refusing to use the walker the physical therapist recommended, calling it a sign of weakness. I was in the kitchen making his breakfast when I heard the crash. He had tried to get up too quickly, lost his balance, and went down hard. The sound of his body hitting the linoleum made my stomach drop. His left hip took most of the impact, and the way he was lying told me everything I needed to know. The ambulance ride to the hospital was silent except for his labored breathing. At the emergency room, a young doctor with tired eyes delivered the news. "We can stabilize him, but he's going to need round-the-clock care now. His mobility is severely compromised." The doctor's gaze lingered on me, taking in my rumpled work clothes and exhausted face. I could see the question in his eyes. Are you really capable of handling this? For the first time in my life, I wasn't sure of the answer. Standing in that sterile hallway, I felt more alone than I'd ever been.
Sitting in the hospital parking lot after visiting hours, a memory hit me like a physical blow. I was 8 years old, wearing my best dress for the school's spring concert. I'd been chosen to sing a solo, Somewhere Over the Rainbow, and had practiced for weeks. I scanned the audience frantically, looking for Dad's face in the sea of parents with cameras. Mom squeezed my hand backstage. "Don't count on him showing up, honey," she whispered. "You know how he is." But I did count on him. I sang that song to his empty chair, my voice cracking on the high notes. Afterward, when the other kids ran to their parents with flowers and hugs, I stood alone until Mom finally appeared. She'd been working late again, trying to make ends meet because Dad spent his paycheck on beer and lottery tickets. Now Mom was gone, dead from cancer 2 years ago. And all I had left was the man who taught me that love was something you earned through disappointment. The man who laughed at my promise to care for him, not knowing that someday I'd have to choose whether to keep it. The social worker handed me a pamphlet for respite care with the enthusiasm of someone selling a product she knew was defective. It's temporary, she explained, and there's a waiting list, several months probably. The facility looked decent in the brochure, but the cost made my head spin. Even with insurance, I'd have to sell everything I owned and probably declare bankruptcy. When I showed the pamphlet to Dad, his reaction was swift and vicious. "So that's your master plan? Dump me in some warehouse for old people and wash your hands of me?" His voice dripped with contempt. "I knew you'd bail on me eventually. You never could stick with anything." But this time, instead of shrinking under his words, I found myself smiling. It wasn't a happy smile. It was something colder, more calculating. "We'll see, Dad," I said quietly. "We'll see what happens." For the first time in our relationship, he was the one who looked uncertain. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. The dynamic that had defined us for 29 years was finally beginning to crack. I woke up at 2 in the morning to the sound of shuffling feet and rattling pills. In the kitchen, I found Dad standing over the counter in his underwear, his hand shaking as he tried to open a bottle of heart medication. A half-empty bottle of whiskey sat next to him, and broken glass sparkled on the floor where he dropped a tumbler. His eyes were wild when he looked up at me, filled with a desperation I'd never seen before. "You're trying to get rid of me," he whispered, his voice hoarse and frightened. "I know what you're planning. You think I'm stupid?" The pills scattered across the counter as his shaking intensified. For a moment, I saw him clearly, not as the cruel father who tormented me for years, but as a scared, sick old man who had finally realized he was completely dependent on the daughter he'd spent decades destroying. "I know it," he repeated, tears starting to slide down his cheeks. For the first time in my life, I didn't rush to reassure him. I just stood there, watching him fall apart, feeling nothing but cold satisfaction. Mrs. Caldwell from across the street appeared at my door the next morning with a tuna casserole and concerned eyes. She was one of those neighborly women who kept track of everyone's business from behind her kitchen curtains. "Honey," she settled the dish in my hands, "I heard shouting last night. Is everything all right over here?" Her pity was worse than her cooking. I could see it in the way she looked at me, the same way people had looked at me my whole life. Poor Callie, struggling again. Poor Callie can't catch a break. "You know," she continued, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "you don't owe him your whole life. Sometimes the kindest thing is to let professionals handle things." She squeezed my hand with her soft, warm fingers. I wanted to believe her, wanted to accept that I had choices beyond this endless cycle of obligation and abuse. But Dad's voice from all those years ago still echoed louder than her gentle wisdom. "You'll never amount to anything." The problem was, I was starting to wonder if he might be wrong about that too. The call from the lawyer came on a Friday afternoon while I was folding Dad's laundry. "Mrs. Morrison, this is Janet Webb from Webb & Associates. I have some paperwork here naming you as your father's power of attorney. Are you aware of this arrangement?" I nearly dropped the phone. Power of attorney? Dad had never mentioned anything like that. "I'm sorry, there must be a mistake." But the lawyer was persistent. "The documents are quite clear, signed and notarized 3 years ago. If your father becomes unable to make his own financial and medical decisions, you have complete authority over his affairs." She faxed the papers over within the hour. There it was, in black and white, Robert Morrison's signature, shaky but unmistakable, giving his daughter complete control over his life. He must have signed it thinking it was a joke, never imagining his worthless daughter would actually be in a position to use it. The irony was delicious. The man who laughed at my promise to care for him had legally ensured that I was the only one who could. When I confronted Dad with the power of attorney documents, his reaction was explosive. His face turned purple, veins bulging in his neck as he struggled to get out of his recliner. "That's not what those papers are for," he shouted, spittle flying from his lips. "I signed those in case of emergency. You're supposed to do what I want." The oxygen tube fell from his nose as he gestured wildly. "You're nothing. You'll always be nothing. You can't make decisions for me." But his rage felt different now, desperate instead of commanding. I held up the folder with calm hands, no longer the frightened child who used to cower under his verbal assaults. "According to this, Dad, I can make whatever decisions I think are best for you." My voice was steady, almost gentle. The lawyer was very clear about that. The silence that followed was heavier than all his shouting. For the first time in my life, I had real power over him, and we both knew it. His face went from purple to gray as the reality sunk in. The game had changed, and he was no longer in control. 2 weeks later, another official visitor appeared at our door. This time it was a sheriff's deputy with an eviction notice. Dad's house, the kingdom he'd ruled with such cruelty, was 3 months away from foreclosure. He'd been lying about handling the mortgage for over a year. The bank wanted their money, and they wanted it now. 60 days to vacate, the deputy said, handing me the papers. After that, we'll be back with a locksmith. I read through the documents while Dad sat in stunned silence. The house he'd inherited from his parents, the house where he'd raised me with his fists and his words, was worth less than what he owed on it. His kingdom was built on lies and debt, and I was standing in the ruins. "How much do we owe?" I asked the deputy. The number made my knees weak. Even if I liquidated everything I owned and worked 3 jobs for the next 5 years, I couldn't save this place. Dad's empire was crumbling, and there was nothing either one of us could do to stop it. The drive to another potential nursing facility was thick with unspoken tension. Dad stared out the passenger window, his jaw clenched tight, refusing to acknowledge what was happening. Every traffic light felt like a countdown to his inevitable surrender. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white, fighting the urge to say something cruel, something that would hurt him the way he'd hurt me for decades. The facility was newer than the others, with bright windows and cheerful murals on the walls, but I already knew how this would end. The pattern was always the same. They'd look at his file, see the debt and the complications, and politely decline. Dad's breathing got shallower as we pulled into the parking lot. He was scared, I realized. Maybe for the first time in his life, he was genuinely afraid. The thought should have brought me satisfaction, but instead I felt strangely empty. This wasn't the victory I'd imagined as a child when I dreamed of him finally getting what he deserved. The administrator was professional, but firm. She flipped through Dad's file with practiced efficiency, her expression growing more neutral with each page. "I'm sorry," she said finally, "but we can't accommodate your father at this time. His medical needs are complex, and frankly, the financial situation makes it impossible." Dad's face went white, then gray. His hands started to shake. Not from medication or illness, but from pure panic. For the first time in my life, I saw real fear in his eyes. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "It means," the administrator said gently, "that you'll need to explore other options, perhaps family care or a state-funded facility." She turned to me with sympathetic eyes. "I understand this is difficult, but we have to think about our other residents." Dad looked at me then, really looked at me, searching my face for some sign that I'd fight for him, that I'd find a way to fix this. I met his gaze steadily and said nothing. The silence stretched between us like a canyon. Back in the car, something inside Dad finally broke. Not with anger or rage, but with a quiet, devastating collapse that made the air feel thick. His shoulders shook as silent tears ran down his cheeks, the first time I'd ever seen him cry. It wasn't the dramatic sobbing of someone seeking sympathy. It was the broken weeping of a man who'd finally realized he was completely alone. "Please," he whispered, the word barely audible. "I'm scared, Callie. I don't want to die in some state warehouse." His vulnerability should have melted my heart, should have triggered all those years of trained compassion. Instead, I felt something darker rising in my chest, a cold satisfaction that tasted like rust and old wounds. "You should have thought about that before," I said quietly, starting the engine. The words hung in the air between us as we drove home in silence. For the first time in our relationship, I was the one in control of his fear. It was a feeling I'd waited 29 years to experience. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with 2 pieces of paper in front of me. On the left, an estimate for private nursing care that would bankrupt me within 6 months. On the right, an application for state-funded care that would put him on a waiting list for at least a year. Both options felt like poison, but in different ways. My phone buzzed with another overdue bill notice. The electricity would be shut off next week if I didn't pay. The water company was sending final warnings. Dad's medical expenses had already drained my savings account. I thought about his leather notebook, about all those years of documentation proving I was worthless. I thought about his laugh when I was 17, promising to take care of him. Most of all, I thought about the power of attorney papers sitting in my purse, the legal document that made him my guardian and gave me complete control over his future. For the first time in my life, the choice was entirely mine, and I knew exactly what I was going to do. I spent 3 hours writing the most important letter of my life. It was addressed to the county social services office, and every word was chosen with surgical precision. I documented Dad's history of emotional abuse, his financial irresponsibility, and his complete failure to plan for his own care. I attached copies of his debt statements, medical records, and most importantly, excerpts from his cruel notebook. My father has made it clear, through both words and actions, that he views me as inadequate and worthless. Given his documented history of verbal abuse and financial manipulation, I believe state care would be the most appropriate option for his situation. I included my power of attorney paperwork and a formal request to be removed from any financial responsibility for his care. The letter felt like confession and revenge rolled into one terrifying package. When I hit send on the email, my hands were shaking, but for the first time in years, they weren't shaking from fear. They were shaking from the intoxicating rush of finally having power over the man who'd spent my entire life making me feel powerless. 3 days later, I came home from my remaining job to find Dad sitting in his recliner, staring at me with hollow eyes. The oxygen tank hissed softly beside him, the only sound in the heavy silence. "They called me," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "The social worker. She told me what you wrote about me." I set my purse down carefully, maintaining eye contact. There was no point in denying it now. "And what did she say?" Dad's hands trembled as he reached for his oxygen tube. "She said they've expedited my application for state care, said my case was compelling." He paused, studying my face like he was seeing me for the first time. "She read me parts of your letter, about the notebook, about the things I said to you." For a moment, I thought he might apologize, might finally acknowledge the damage he'd done. Instead, he just shook his head slowly. "I never knew you had it in you," he said, and I couldn't tell if he was proud or terrified. Maybe both. The silence stretched between us, 29 years of pain finally balanced on the scales. The county office moved faster than I had expected. Within a week, they'd scheduled an assessment and arranged for Dad's transfer to Pine Valley State Care Facility. The woman handling his case was efficient, but not unkind. She explained that his assets would need to be liquidated to offset the cost of his care. I almost laughed at the word assets, a broken recliner, a house headed for foreclosure, and that damning leather notebook were hardly treasures, but they'd take what they could get. The day before the transfer, I packed his belongings into 2 suitcase-sized boxes. His entire life fit into containers I could carry with one hand each. As I folded his clothes, I found myself remembering him as he used to be. Younger, stronger, filled with the casual cruelty that had shaped my entire childhood. Now he was just a sick old man waiting to be warehoused by the state. The word inheritance had always felt like a chain around my neck, but watching his life dissolve into cardboard boxes,
It felt more like a punchline to a joke that had gone on too long. I visited Dad once at Pine Valley, 3 weeks after he'd been transferred. The facility was clean but institutional, filled with the smell of disinfectant and the sounds of daytime television echoing down long hallways. I found him in the common room, sitting in a wheelchair by a window that looked out onto a parking lot. He'd lost weight, and his hair had gone completely gray. When I walked up, he didn't look at me right away. "Hello, Dad," I said, taking the chair beside him. He nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the window. "The food's terrible here," he said finally, "and my roommate snores." It was such a normal complaint, such an ordinary thing to say that for a moment we almost felt like a regular father and daughter. Then he turned to look at me, and his eyes were different. Not angry anymore, just tired. "You won," he said quietly. "Are you happy now?" I studied his face. This man who'd shaped my entire life through his disappointment and cruelty. "I don't feel like I won anything," I told him honestly. "I just feel tired." As I walked away, I heard him call my name, but I didn't turn around. Now I sit in my small apartment writing this story because I need people to understand that revenge isn't what you think it will be. There were no fireworks when Dad finally stopped laughing at me, no moment of triumph when the nursing homes turned him away, no satisfaction when he broke down crying in my car, just a hollow feeling where my anger used to be, and the strange realization that survival might be its own kind of victory. I kept my promise to take care of him, just not the way either of us expected. Sometimes late at night, I remember his laugh from when I was 17, but it doesn't hurt anymore. It just sounds like an old recording of someone I used to know. The notebook is gone now and destroyed in the move, but I don't need it anymore. I have this story instead, and the knowledge that I'm stronger than he ever gave me credit for, stronger than I ever gave myself credit for. The girl he said would never amount to anything grew up to hold his entire future in her hands. Maybe that's not the ending either of us wanted, but it's the one we deserved.
If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like this video, comment, and smash the subscribe button. Also, check out other videos on the channel. We've got more interesting stories for you.